I will start just to break the ice. In a big organization like Telecom Italia, I wonder how Euan way of thinking is today possible. What do you think in reality then?
Well, there are typically telco-related problems to the need of a change in use of social media that are quite a big problem inside a bigger problem, that is the fact that Italy is probably one of the countries where the broadcasting culture has made the biggest amount of damage. So I think that my first request for sympathy is beginning to look at those who manage a two-way infrastructure, and I think we should be considered as allies in this change rather than enemies, first of all. And things are slightly changed thanks to a number of very successful initiatives as to how our company is perceived. But internally, yes, there are big problems because big corporations is the place where it's extremely easy to sell bad ideas. And in a period of transition, when the power is in the power to take decisions, business-critical decisions, is in the hands and in the minds of people that are in their 40s and that now manage big budgets in corporate communication. Well, for them, it's too easy to sell simple ideas to their bosses that are in their 50s. So their bosses are asking, okay, let's do a Twitter account, let's do a Facebook fan page, and it's too easy to say to them, okay, and that's all. Fortunately, in this company, there are people that are trying to create real relations in the real world, real two-way relations from our people, because our people are the non-duplicable assets in a company like ours, with real people in the real world. And social media is beginning to be seen as a tool to change the real world. And this is a major cultural step for a company like ours.
But do you think that people is prepared? Because in Euan's title there is a double way of reading it. Okay, organizations are not prepared to allow people to tweet. But do people understand that when they are in a given situation, they have to behave differently? They are not home. They are in a business. They are not, they are not sometimes able to change the mental pattern and understand their position. Do you think that also people need to change and not just corporate?
One interesting conversation I have with quite a few of my clients on that particular point, on the point about tweets, is the disclaimers often I see that clients and employees will post on their Twitter biographies or their blog biographies, that the comments that they publish there are their own and not the comments of their companies. And I often say to them, there's not a great deal of point in doing that, because if you say something, wherever you say it, if you are employed by an organisation, it will reflect on the reputation of that organisation, it will reflect on your personal reputation, and it will reflect on your professional reputation as well. I think the two are inseparable. And I think the challenge, you talked about this, Dave talked about this yesterday in his concept of organisational resilience, is about encouraging a culture change where we don't attempt to apply a rigid hierarchy over what we say and what we do and how we work, but we create certain conditions and values that everyone at every level can recognise and can understand and can put into practice in the way that they behave, where they communicate, how they communicate, and the tone of voice that they use.
I think working that out is should be a collective process. I think one of the challenges at the moment, and I said a little bit about the outside going faster than the inside, there are lots of companies who are aspiring to be 2.0 outside the firewall, but they're not even 1.0 inside it. So you get this fast networked world that they can't react to because their processes and their chains of communication are too rigid and too slow.
I think that's right, and I think a symptom of that, where in many companies that I work with that deal with, where they then encounter a problem, is that they create a certain image, a certain veneer of themselves on the outside for the way they want to see and the way they want to behave. But their processes, their organisation internally is too rigid. And that means they're unable to get the stuff out of the organisation that people are going to be interested in. They find it very hard to create content, to encourage conversation,
I have a
to give them
story
something to say.
about that. Not much people know, but I started a network inside my company 15 years ago. When I built the first civic network in my village with other people here in Italy, I applied that model inside the company. And my partners at the time told me, "You're completely crazy. Why you allow people to talk about their books, their reading, and blah, blah?" And I said, "I think it's going to work because it works for the city. It should work for the company as well." And actually, after 2 years, I made a presentation at the Bocconi University about the result of what at that time I called the corporate network. There was no name for this kind of thing, okay? Net result, I could prove that the speed of communication inside my company, which was not that big, was 50 people, but every decision we need to communicate arrived at the target 10 times faster, that we could move faster in changing as a company. But most of all, when we had a big problem with some unloyal employees who left the company and tried to kill the company, all the others defended the company. So my point is not just a PR issue, but really understanding that you are part of that organism.
And that, I don't mean
and
to be too critical.
I survived because my people defended, and it was not them against me, it was them against them.
And that's because it's about relationships. And not to be too unfair on Tim, but people use the phrase creating content. A friend of mine, Hallie Soot, back in the early days of blogging, once said, content is a pimp's word. And she meant that people, she'd had some very genuine, heartfelt blog posts that had been taken by a newspaper and turned into content. And, you know, from what you were saying earlier, Marco, I think it's a million miles away from a genuine individual personal enthusiasm for a product or a company or whatever.
Absolutely. And I think, coming back to your question, are the people inside the companies ready to do it? I think that's probably not really the question, but I think they're more ready than we think. They might be scared for some reasons. Companies themselves, you know, especially in Italy, we were talking about the owner versus manager culture. But I think the question we should ask is, are they good enough? I know it sounds like a little bit provocative, but again, we're giving the front end of communication to the person. So everything we said is absolutely, we all agree, but are we really ready to, are they really ready to represent the company? Are they good communicators? Because in the end, that's what it is about, you know, being able to understand all the smart sides of public communications with different stakeholders. And so it's a complicated business. And they surely are genuine, they surely are passionate, but are they smart enough to handle that? Or should they be tutored? Is it
But they exist. I mean, they act anyhow. You know, they pick up a phone and talk to a customer. And if they're idiot, they're physically idiot rather than virtually idiot.
Regardless
but not just because they exist, you just let them handle your communication. You know what I mean? So I'm completely for.
Tim and I were talking about this last night. When you say handle your communication, that's still thinking in terms of a channel. And we were talking about the balance where you have younger folks coming into a PR organization.
There's another, this is a typically Italian problem that relates to many industries and many other fields. The fact that since the generation of the 40s are empowered, they're immediate reflex is to try to get benefit from this. And this is not always something inside your company, because, for instance, in the communication industry, there's a whole set of interlocutors: the media themselves, PR firms, advertising firms, brand experts, and so forth. And we all help each other to maintain the status quo.
Exactly.
And so it's not just a corporate problem; it's a whole ecosystem that has to change. And it's probably the 40-somethings in power understand what might be the return on investment from the change, but it's so difficult to explain to our bosses, so-called, that we prefer to sell bad ideas, which is once again not a problem with corporate communication only. For instance, at Sony, we all remember that a very bad idea to insert an anti-copying system inside a CD was extremely well sold. And the guy who had this idea got a tremendous career and went away from the company just before the problem came out. So until we are able to, until we reward these bad ideas inside our companies, I'm afraid that all these very interesting conversations that we are doing here are changing just a little slice of the cake.
Okay, but it's a start. But I think you picked up on my use of the word content just then quite rightly. And that actually, I think we're talking about essentially the same things. Usually in your presentation, you talked about sound. And I think what we're all talking about is something that is genuine, of substance, of value, not simply the message,
actually, I used
the mechanism,
to talk
but
about
actually the meaning
rather than
behind
content.
That. Yes. That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
We call it senso
I use the word content because that, for me, implies substance to that meaning. I think to some extent it's semantic, but it's an important distinction to draw. I think the interesting opportunity for organisations, you touched in your presentation, you and Adriana talked yesterday, I think, about certain kind of almost universal principles in the way that we as individuals behave, whether we're independent consultants or whether we work within organisations. They remain constant and true. I think the interesting change in is how organisations function themselves, and where I see the opportunity. And I think the challenge for many organisations, given the issues you just talked about, are in the change of the media environment we operate in. That we've gone from an environment of scarcity in meaning and content to plenty, that before the internet came along, news and information and entertainment, it was materially limited, it was spatially limited, and it was limited in time as well. If you wanted to watch the news, you had to either buy a paper first thing in the morning or watch the 9 o'clock news in the evening. If you wanted to create some news or content, you know, either you get a TV camera or get hold of a printing press. That's quite expensive to do, and it was spatially limited as well. You could only access it within a certain range. Now that's completely changed. Information, meaning content, is plentiful, and we can all create it, and I'm sure many of you are doing that on Twitter now, or possibly blogging about this conference. That's enormously disruptive, of course, to media companies and journalists, because this precious commodity they once had has disappeared. Everybody has it. But for organisations, and actually if I could do a quick show of hands at this point, how many of you here work for an organisation or run an organisation? Could I have some hands up? Okay. And how many of you are independent consultants? Would you say? A mix. And how many of you are academics or students?
What else? What the hell are doing the others?
And what about, yes? Well, I saw a balance spread, so I'll assume if we extrapolate that, I think we're probably talking about an even mix here. But I think the opportunity in that environment for organisations, to go back to the content and meaning point, is to become media companies. You can actually start to tell your own story directly to the people that you want to reach. The trick is, the challenge of this, and this is my personal bugbear on the content point, is actually getting the stuff to enable you to do that, whatever we label it as, teasing it out from the individuals in your team, the colleagues who are running the plant in the deepest, darkest jungles of South America, perhaps, or whether they might be located.
But that's where, if you deploy the technologies internally, those stories start to surface anyway. I mean, and it was coming back to your. I mean, I've heard this about 4 times now, that it's different because we're Italian, or it's more difficult because we're Italian. And I hear that in every company I work with. Oh, it's different for us. It's difficult for us. And I don't think there's any inevitability. You know, as a country,
it's just a national specificity, might say. Not necessarily. We all even have big advantages. As Italians, we are natural meaningfulness creators, yes. Which is not content creation. Everything coming from Italy has a strong meaning and a cultural background, yes, passion, yes. And so forth. So this is one of the advantages. But unfortunately, this value is still underexploited somewhat, because we basically are afraid for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So,
but this goes back to the idea
of a trade-off
of the Trojan mice, because you know you're never going to get anywhere asking for permission to do this stuff, as I discovered, because you're asking permission from people who don't understand it, or if they do understand it, they don't like it. So you have to work on the basis of asking for forgiveness, and you don't want to have to ask for forgiveness for huge, big things. So you do small things, and enough if you do small things, and that's how culture changes.
Tactics through strategy.
Yeah. I think that thinking about the role of PRs in this case, you know, and I'm looking at Marco and thinking about that, because one of the things I know from my experience with it was called Lulu, the network, you know, was crazy. I wanted a crazy enough name to explain that it was a crazy idea. So Lulu Network really told me something. What was the real challenge for me is to help people always to have the complete picture, like the story we had yesterday about the valley and the cleaning of, you know. The problem is that employees tend to see single facts, you know, and probably making a big thing about a real minor fact, that it's completely out of context, they don't know what's behind it, etc. Don't you think that the role of PR is not just to publish outside an image, but also to understand people inside a company, to have the full picture of what's going on? Otherwise, we will never be able to talk in a real good way. So, what do you think about that?
And also, absolutely, and also, to build the trust, what I was saying before, are these people ready to communicate? It sounds like a lack of trust, like I don't really trust they are ready for doing that. I don't think they shouldn't, I think they should. But it's not only me. I don't think any company trusts their employees as a whole to be ready for communicating. If we read any company policy, usually they go like this. You can tweet, but tweet on your own. You can talk about this, but you cannot talk about this, not talk about this, not talk about this, not talk about this. This is in charge of the communication department. Leave this to professionals. You're not a professional. We don't trust you. This is the subtext of any social media policy. And they're proud of it, you know? And so we should build trust. And also, it's an organizational problem once again. The communication is in the hand of communication, who writes the policy and says that the communication must be in the hand of the communication department. So we don't trust you. So,
Marco, I've been working in the PR industry for many years, and I agree with this, and I know that the worst consequence is that the real professionalism is perceived in this industry is the capability to create boundaries and high walls between the key messages and the rest of the company. If you're not able to do this, you're not perceived as a professional, which is absolutely the contrary of what we're trying to do.
And to go back to your point about the people not being ready for it, there's two sides to it, because if you are the individual, if you're the first person in an organization who's trusted to talk in public, and back to Gigi's point, it's almost impossible for you to have the full consequence or context within which you're writing that tweet. That's really scary. So I think they need a lot of support and help and systems to help them do that.
I was telling you the first project we did was going inside a large car maker and making everybody speak, the people that pick the fabric for the interior of the car. And there was so much interesting outside because it was the first time you could actually look into the making of a car, of a product, and getting to know it and give your feedback. And it was very interesting for them, but these people were scared, were really scared. They were like, can we really do that? Are you sure? Did you ask my boss? Did my boss ask his boss? Did my boss ask his other boss? Because there's no trust among them. And so, on one hand, this is the problem. They are ready. It's another issue. There's some basics in communication. I agree with your power game vision of the public relations and the communications, but there's some basics skills that must be taught, that we must have if we publicly communicate. So trust and training probably should come together. We were with this blog team running inside, Fiat to shoot videos and ask the people. And so the people were scared. They did it because they were allowed to, they were trained, and so they did good because they look at the camera and they were like, what should I say?
Yeah.
They've never done that. So you need to tell them, speak briefly, do that, train them a little bit. And we even, this is fun, but at some stage we even got arrested by the internal police because we were going around with the camera.
The internal police?
Yeah, the security, They
I
were like, what are you doing? And so they took our tape and then they gave it back. But it's normal, In many organizations, if you start going around, they don't know you're not an employee and you have a camera. Try to work in any multinational like that. You won't get out of it free, So the culture is distrust. The culture and should be trust first, training second, and then and we can have a choral enterprise speaking all together without fear and with the right.
You make a very interesting point there. So one thing that I just wanted to pick up on about policies and behavioural policies within organisations. And I work in an agency myself, in a PR agency. I wouldn't really say I do PR anymore, but that's a separate point. And much of the work I think we do just involves giving organisations a fresh perspective. But particularly on that point about policy, often what we'll find ourselves doing is helping organisations figure out what their policy, their code of ethics or values or whatever you might want to call it should be. And very often when we review them, they're very, very good at telling people what they can't do and what they're not allowed to do. But it doesn't actually say anywhere what they can do or what they might be encouraged to do and the benefits of that. And actually, if you can think in those terms, then it becomes enormously empowering for people. And the point that you raise about confidence and the sense that you have the liberty and the license to go out there and communicate as an employee, all of a sudden I think the environment begins to change.
If I receive a letter that says on Twitter, you cannot do this, you cannot do this, I don't do anything.
You're not, exactly.
Yeah, but try for a moment to change.
Yep.
Let's change even
to exatonic.
Mental model, okay? Mental scheme.
Exatonic company.
Okay, let's change scale. Now, octatonic, Stravinsky octatonic scale. Very difficult, okay? One, there is no Twitter. Twitter, disappear.
Oh.
There is no computer. Computer contains asbestos, degenerate cancer, okay? We can't touch any computer anymore. Yes.
Yeah,
No.
Can I close it?
Okay. This is the scenario. Do you think that people have the capability of talking and communicating without those toys?
Well,
or those toys enable these abilities?
No, I think what we're seeing is a social change aided by technology rather than driven by technology. I think partly what's changing is the relationship between individuals and organisations. And we're coming out the end of, 50 years of relative corporate stability, where the aspiration was to get a good degree and get a good job in a good corporation and stay there till you're retired. And they broke that contract because that world stopped working. So I think we're seeing people having to think more for themselves, form their own networks, and take more responsibility for their own work lives, independent of the technology.
Because one of the things that when I started the Civic Network project, I have my American friends who came over, and I remember I was in Perugia, in Corso Vannucci in Perugia, and they asked me, where is people going? Nowhere. Why they walk? Because it was no sense for people to walk if you don't have a destination, a precise scope. I said, we do the vasche. What is swimming? There is no water. Strange Italians, why you swim on marble?
In Rome, there are people asking me why people are hanging out in Piazza di Spagna with no clue.
What they're doing. So then he came to Desenzano, to my town, and he saw the same thing happening under the arches, you know. And there was my wife, and he was looking at my wife stopping once in a while and talking to people. And I said, what is she doing? I said, she is the mayor of the town. She knows everybody. No, she's just from here. And I said, she is a router that at every contact changes the relationship map of that situation.
So given that the Italians are so good at that...
Sì, no, non ti faccio parlare. No, I have a question. How is Trieste? How is Trieste, Marco? Oh, thank you. This is very important. Question from the public. Mark.
I have a question. You talked about the new paradigm of the cloud. And my simple question is, what happens when your internet connection goes down? You are now addicted to this new paradigm, but yet we don't have reliable infrastructure to have that existence, unless, of course, you're at some corporation with a nice fast line. But out in the real world, I'm saving my files, I'm doing my work, I'm communicating, but very often the line goes down. How to resolve this, this problem?
The point is, do you rely on electricity? Do you rely on roads? Do you rely on train? All the infrastructures are there, and people is doing as much as possible to keep it alive. But this is one of the issues why, for instance, I say that there is no security whatsoever in the cloud, because it depends not on you, not on what you can do, but in somebody else's, and you don't know where it is. So there is a convenient part of it, but it is also a risk, and you balance it. The answer is there is no certainty about the fact that the cloud will be there, question one. But second, this is part of life. Are you sure that your car is going to work? You do all your possible, but what if you're in a train like yesterday and the Italian rail says, due to a mechanical problem from Mestre to Trieste,
we were on the same train, 80 kilometers per hour.
80 kilometers per hour.
It was so sad and so
forever.
depressing and so funny.
So, I think that this is part of the uncertainty. I think that the good things about the cloud is that it concentrates more on what we need to do, but is big challenge because it takes away from us large piece of control, or as Dave said, doing things. We learn and we change our mental models in doing things, not just in intellectual relationship with what we're doing. We need physical, we need to touch something. Our body is programmed to give us feedbacks from what we do and what we touch.
And I think that uncertainty point, sorry, if I can pick up on that very quickly, I think that's a particularly interesting one, because in many of the projects I've worked on in the digital space with clients, often the benefits they get from it aren't necessarily the ones that they thought they were going to get. They're going out there with a particular plan or strategy, and it's perhaps to build their reputation in a particular area, become the thought leader, maybe, to a phrase that you used in your presentation, Euan. And actually, it turns out that they get a very different kind of benefit. you talked about an aspiration that all companies will eventually get to a point where all their employees are blogging. And I've worked with clients, where certain employees, the CEO maybe, has wanted to set up a blog, and to do that successfully, they must want to do that themselves, hoping it's going to build their reputation in a certain area. Actually, the big benefit turns out to be internal communication, that the biggest audience for that blog is actually the employees, and that they're turning and reading the blog, perhaps because they recognise or they see the fact that the CEO is publishing their views publicly, means that these points of view have perhaps an enhanced importance, and they're much more likely to look at that than the internal memo.
How are the questions there? Micro. Coming. Microphone. Bop. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Microphone. Good.
So, Euan, I think in your presentation you talk about ephemeral meritocracy. So you have this idea of a less hierarchy, more participation, and yet the people that you're choosing to work with are the people who are maybe worst placed to act on those things. I suppose the question I'm asking is, why are you focusing on your attention on companies that are very big, very bureaucratic, very hierarchical, rather than trying to establish new organizations that can embody the sort of values that you're talking about? And I suppose the question for the rest of you is, if you believe what Euan is saying, why are you working for companies at all?
Good question.
I might answer to the last part of the question by saying what President Kennedy said. We went to the moon because it was difficult.
Yeah. Bravo.
Not because it was easy.
But also, I mean, the companies that I work with all sorts of companies. I do work with small companies as well. And I do occasionally think with the bigger ones that I'm spending my life trying to resuscitate dinosaurs when it might be kinder just to shoot them. But having said that, those dinosaurs still have such an impact on our worlds. So for instance, oil companies. I've had people criticize me for even working with oil companies. And I said, well, we all still drive cars. They're not going to go away. And I genuinely, I'm trying to help the transition from that, I think, dysfunctional world. And, I think it's possible, again, we talked about this yesterday, to conceive of a large enterprise that's made up of semi or fully autonomous smaller units. So I think that's what motivates me, if you like. And also, I mean, I've worked with NATO, right? And being a pacifist, that made me think hard about what I was doing working with NATO. But my view is that if I can just help individuals within that organization start to have a voice, and then that's how you will change the nature of those organizations. They're not going to go away. We can't control them effectively by legislation from outside. We have to try and change them from inside.
Can I attempt a musical analogy to answer your question?
Go for it.
Harking back to your presentation, I'll do my best. Here goes. Kurt Cobain, rock pioneer, frontman of Nirvana, he always used cheap guitars, even when he became a millionaire rock star and could afford the best Fender Stratocaster or Gibson Les Paul or whatever it might be. Why did he do that? And he said it's because, one, he could break them up a bit if he wanted to, but two, he liked the challenge of getting great music out of something that was somehow technically restricted in its capabilities. He enjoyed that challenge. Those constraints inspired his creativity. I feel the same way about organisations, I have to say. I find them fascinating, their workings, where you can push them, where you can challenge them. And actually now, again, working in the digital space, some of the most interesting work that I do and interesting projects that I see come from very rigid, very hierarchical organisations that often work in highly regulated sectors, finance companies, pharmaceutical companies that have to deal with a great deal of industry regulation, but somehow are facing this growing demand, this growing pressure to be more open in the way that they work and behave, from their employees, from their customers and their stakeholders. And how you manage the two is absolutely fascinating.
I think it's, my point of view is, I think because when we talk about Twitter and all the good new stuff and introduce this into cooperation, we don't want to do it just for fun or because we are nerds, because we are techies. In my case, I think because I want to change the world. I want to change the situation. And obviously, changing a small company is fun, but changing Telecom Italia or BT, if you can, you can do big things. I can tell you, I worked for 6 months with a genius that is Professor Zanella, is the president of CRS4 in Sardinia. And he is the one who started information technology at CERN in Geneva. So he's the daddy or the grandfather of all of us. He hired a team and all that. And I asked him, why are you doing this in Sardinia? Why don't you? He said, because I did it already at the CERN, and that was difficult, very difficult. But here, if we make it possible to use technology to change, we change the life of people. We will no longer have young people that has to emigrate Sardinia. So what I want to do it here, because here I can change a life. The reason why I volunteer in the music school at Desenzano and not in Sesto, because in Sesto, in the Dolomites, there is a musical culture. In every little village, there is a band, a group, a choir. In Desenzano, 30,000 inhabitants, there is no music. So let's do it. I mean, this is the point. It's more challenging do it in Fiat and in Telecom Italia, not because it's difficult, but because if you can make the change, then it's a real change in life of people.
And also, if you want, we can introduce you even more hierarchical structure than these companies we were talking about, or that Euan consults to, which is Italian owners enterprises, le aziende padronali italiane. That's a place where there's the same complexity plus a cult of personality for the entrepreneur, which sometimes it's also due because it's a visionary guy. We were talking about with Euan before some cases. And all we were saying before, the fear of not respecting hierarchies, the levels and everything, it's even more stronger there, because in these companies, there's one voice. The man, the entrepreneur, Mr. Benetton with his vision, Mr. Illy with his coffee, Mr. Agnelli with Fiat, and so on. And the power, the respect, mostly due towards these persons who actually were innovators, were genius entrepreneurs, were great entrepreneurs, is due, but nobody will whisper a tweet when he is present, and nobody will whisper for the company because he's the voice and is everything else. And the challenge there is double, because you have the structural challenge, but an absolute hierarchical challenge. And I don't even know if it's fair or right to do it. That's a second question also. In that company, that the image of the consumers is all around the entrepreneur. And so that company is a successful company because that man is there. So is it right in that kind of companies to destructure their communication, or should you really push forward to that and run with your genius? Think of the designer firms, Armani. Do you think anybody at Armani would, it's not, and you were saying before, if Twitter wasn't there, people at Armani don't tweet, don't speak with journalists, don't even speak with you about the company. They're completely, muted by this.
Yep. 1, 2.
I have a question.
3, then coffee. I want a coffee. I mean, or either you bring me a coffee and coffee to everybody, or...
We have 10 minutes, Gigi.
Okay, good.
My question is for you, Euan. Given your book's title, so Organization Don't Tweet, at the same time I see that people are becoming brands, especially on Facebook pages, Twitter, and I have to say I do use Facebook pages to brand or to promote my book, or so. If people are becoming brands, are we still people or not? How do you?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I know. I think that the idea of a personal brand is problematic because it can, you know, when people become focused on their brand, whether you're a company or an individual, rather than on doing worthwhile and useful things, then you've kind of lost the point. But clearly, individuals have increased ability to create a sphere of influence. And what's really interesting is watching, like when Robert Scoble was blogging for Microsoft, and the value of him as an individual with a view that wasn't always aligned with Microsoft's, and the game he had to play with staying close enough to them to stay in a job. Or with the BBC, the economics editor Robert Peston has a very good personal blog, which is under the BBC's banner, but he's able to be more thoughtful and more thought-provoking on his blog than he is in the tabloid television output. So that's interesting, watching the balancing act between his credibility, I'd use the word credibility and influence rather than brand, and the organisations. And if Robert left the BBC, I would continue to subscribe to his output rather than listen to the person who he's replaced by in the BBC. So I think that's an interesting, and back to sort of in a way Gigi's question, it's the balance between the individual and the organisation that happens to be being speeded up by the technology.
Can I have a brief perspective on that one as well? Do you have time? I think a brand is something that you have an opinion about. Nothing more and nothing less, fundamentally. And I think so the basis for a strong brand then needs to be the contents, the meaning, the sound, as we talked about earlier on. Robert Peston is a very good example because he's a very opinionated journalist and you will follow him wherever he goes. And I think then, for me, that returns to the point we were talking about earlier on about the opportunity for organisations to become media companies and to actually have some substance behind what they say, backed up by what they do. And then you truly have a brand, whether it's manifested through the individuals and their behaviour, and or also the collective identity when they come together as a company, as a collective, or whatever it might be.
I think that the best example is Apple. When Apple every 6 months shows the world its latest products, it really transmits a vision of the future that has a value regardless of the fact it's branded content. I know this is possible for the extreme power of that brand, but I think that the web gives almost the same chance to many other smaller brands to tell interesting stories that are not anymore advertising because they have a strong value. This is a typical corporate-generated content.
Last question, 1 and 2. Okay.
Interesting. You mentioned Apple, which is the most control freak organization, probably among the most control freak organizations in the world. And this comes to my question: is this that actually every organization, not just companies or corporations, are intrinsically have a control problem. They do want to control their message, and this was way out before digital came on. I mean, in the early 80s, I was asked by the Boy Scouts Association of Italy, I mean, nothing to do with corporations of anything, non-profit, to help them out with their print press, and the guys who actually write for their press. And for a few years, with a few friends, we tried to help them. Then we gave up because, the structure, the organization as such, had some control problems with the message. So isn't that something that really has to do with organizations as such?
Yes, totally. And individuals within organizations. I think the fear of loss of control is one of the biggest hurdles with this stuff. but arguably they never actually had control. They had control over some narrow channels, which they assumed we were all reading, but in fact we weren't, and had the ability to talk in pubs about them whether they liked it or not. Whereas now they can see those pub conversations. And I think they've got a greater opportunity for influence than control. And that's what you're helping them to try and accommodate.
I think organisations are formed to solve certain problems ultimately, whether it's a service they provide or a product they create. But the act of forming an organisation creates new problems in the structure it has to create. And the best you can do is to become aware of that and continue to look for new means to solve those particular problems, and it will create others, and so the cycle continues. But that's where I think a certain humility and a willingness to innovate is very important and explore new ways of operating.